In the decades following 1816, courthouses appeared across the United States and Britain with architectural features that seemed difficult to explain through conventional timelines. These buildings weren't just large. They were designed with record storage capacity that exceeded any reasonable projection based on the populations they served. The official explanation is straightforward. Rapid industrialization and westward expansion created administrative needs, and officials built with optimism about future growth. But the numbers create friction. In 1825, a courthouse was completed in a Pennsylvania county with 4,200 residents. The building contained vault space designed to hold approximately 60,000 linear feet of records, enough for a population of 150,000 people maintaining records for over a century. The county wouldn't reach that population until 1920. It wasn't an isolated case. This is a documentary examination of a pattern, one rooted in observable architectural and institutional records. The observations presented here are based on public archives, building specifications, and census data. No conclusions are being offered. Only questions about timing, scale, and the systems that appeared with unusual consistency across unconnected regions during a compressed historical window. The courthouses built between 1815 and 1850 share something beyond aesthetic similarity. They share structural preparation for bureaucratic systems that had not yet been implemented, and in many cases, would not be standardized for decades. In 1822, a courthouse in upstate New York was designed with 12 separate archive rooms. At the time of construction, the town had 2 part-time clerks and fewer than 800 residents. The building's storage capacity could accommodate records for a population 20 times that size. The architects weren't naive. These were experienced builders working from deliberate plans. The vault dimensions, shelving specifications, and fireproofing measures were calculated with precision. Yet the volume of space designated for official records consistently outpaced the administrative reality of the towns they served by margins that feel disproportionate. In Ohio, a courthouse completed in 1830 featured a 2-story records hall with cast-iron shelving built into the walls. The county had been formally organized for only 7 years. Its entire collection of legal documents at the time of the building's completion could fit into a single cabinet. The shelving remained empty for decades. Across the Atlantic, a similar timing emerges. Between 1820 and 1845, dozens of British municipal buildings were constructed with record vaults that seem anticipatory rather than reactive. A town hall in Lancashire, built in 1838 for a borough of 6,000 people, included basement archive space with humidity-controlled brick chambers and reinforced ceilings, infrastructure associated with document preservation on a scale the town wouldn't require until the early 1900s. The construction wasn't incremental. It was immediate. These weren't buildings that expanded over time to meet growing needs. They were designed from the beginning with full-scale bureaucratic infrastructure already embedded in the architecture. The vaults, the indexing systems, the fireproof doors, they were original features, not additions. In Tennessee, a county courthouse built in 1827 had dedicated spaces for a tax assessor's office, a county clerk's archive, a probate records vault, and a land deed registry. The county's entire administrative staff at the time consisted of 3 elected officials and 1 part-time assistant. The offices sat mostly unused for over 15 years. It raises a question about the nature of institutional planning. Either these towns possessed extraordinary foresight about bureaucratic expansion that hadn't yet been legislated, or the buildings were designed according to a template that assumed certain administrative structures as inevitable. The architecture suggests the latter. In county after county, the floor plans mirror each other. The placement of vault rooms, the dimensions of archive shelving, the reinforced flooring designed to bear the weight of file storage. These features appear with a consistency that cuts across state lines, architect portfolios, and regional building traditions. A courthouse in Kentucky built in 1829 has nearly identical vault specifications to one built in Vermont in 1831. Despite no documented connection between the architects, no shared contractors, and no centralized building standards mandating such designs. Yet the storage capacity in both buildings was calibrated to the same scale. In Britain, the pattern mirrors itself with slight variations. Municipal offices built during the 1830s and 1840s include archive infrastructure that anticipates the formalization of census records, tax documentation, and property registries, systems that wouldn't be fully standardized until the latter half of the century. The timing is difficult to reconcile with reactive construction. Records indicate that many of these buildings were commissioned and designed years before the bureaucratic systems they were meant to house had been legislated into existence. In some cases, the vaults were completed before the filing systems they would eventually contain had even been proposed. It suggests a degree of coordination, or at least an expectation, about the administrative future. In 1833, a small courthouse in rural Indiana was built with a records vault large enough to store documents for a population of 40,000. The county had 1,800 residents. The vault's interior walls were lined with numbered shelving designed for indexed filing, a system the county wouldn't adopt until 1867. The infrastructure waited. The pattern becomes more difficult to dismiss when examined across infrastructure types. Courthouses were not the only buildings constructed with this peculiar relationship between capacity and demand. Between 1825 and 1850, record storage appeared as a foundational feature in municipal buildings, land offices, customs houses, and regional administrative centers throughout the United States and Britain, often in areas where the volume of official documentation barely justified a single filing cabinet. In Buffalo, New York, a customs house completed in 1826 included a fireproof records vault with shelving for approximately 100,000 documents. At the time, Buffalo processed fewer than 2,000 customs transactions per year. The vault's capacity would not be fully utilized until the 1880s. The design wasn't speculative. It was structural. The shelving wasn't installed later. It was built into the masonry. The vault doors, the ventilation systems, the reinforced floors, all original construction. The building anticipated a scale of bureaucratic activity that didn't yet exist. This same logic appeared in land offices across newly organized territories. When Michigan became a state in 1837, its land office in Detroit was housed in a building with archive space designed for a state with 10 times its population. The storage chambers included numbered filing systems and document indexing infrastructure that wouldn't be federally mandated until the 1850s. The question isn't whether officials planned for growth. The question is how they calibrated that growth so precisely, and why the calibration was so consistent across regions with vastly different population densities, economic conditions, and political structures. In Britain, the General Register Office was established in 1837 to centralize birth, marriage, and death records. Within 2 years, regional offices were constructed with archive vaults sized not for the populations they currently served, but for the record-keeping demands of a fully bureaucratized society. A register office in a Yorkshire town of 3,000 people was built with storage for 250,000 individual records. The infrastructure preceded the system. The same timing appears in transportation. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was built with locked dimensions and channel depth that exceeded the cargo volume of the era by substantial margins. It wasn't simply over-engineered for durability. It was scaled for a commercial throughput that wouldn't materialize for 2 decades. Railway stations built in the 1830s and 1840s follow a similar logic. Terminals in towns with populations under 5,000 were constructed with platforms, waiting halls, and freight storage designed for passenger and cargo volumes associated with cities 10 times larger. In 1838, a rail station in rural Pennsylvania was built with a freight depot capable of handling 200 tons of goods per day. The town's entire annual commercial output at the time was approximately 400 tons. The depot sat largely empty for years. These weren't isolated construction errors. They were systematic features of an infrastructural wave that swept through the United States and Britain during a compressed period, roughly 1815 to 1850, in which public works projects consistently anticipated future demands with an accuracy that feels, in hindsight, almost prescient. Water systems provide another example. Municipal waterworks installed during the 1830s and 1840s were designed with pipeline capacity and reservoir volume that exceeded contemporary consumption by factors of 3 to 5. A waterworks system in a Massachusetts town completed in 1842 could supply 500,000 gallons per day. The town's population used fewer than 80,000. The excess wasn't temporary. The infrastructure remained underutilized for decades. In Scotland, a similar pattern emerges in municipal gas lighting systems. Towns that installed gas networks in the 1830s built distribution systems with pipeline grids and storage gasometers sized for populations far larger than those they served. The infrastructure was in place before the demand justified the investment. Whether this reflects inheritance or convergence remains unresolved. But the administrative dimension is harder to explain through conventional models of urban planning. Courthouses, land offices, and municipal record centers weren't simply built large. They were built with internal organization that assumed specific bureaucratic frameworks. In Ohio, a courthouse built in 1835 included separate vault rooms labeled for property deeds, probate records, tax assessments, criminal proceedings, and civil case files. At the time of construction, the county's legal system did not maintain formal distinctions between these categories. The classifications wouldn't be standardized in Ohio until 1851. The labels were original to the building. The architecture embedded a filing taxonomy that hadn't yet been adopted. In England, town halls built during the 1840s included clerk offices with built-in cabinetry designed for index document storage, complete with numbered drawer systems and alphabetical organizing principles that wouldn't be formalized in local government procedure until the 1860s. The furniture anticipated the system. This raises an uncomfortable observation. The infrastructure of bureaucracy, the physical architecture of record-keeping, was installed before the bureaucratic procedures themselves were legislated into existence. It wasn't a matter of months. In many cases, the gap was decades. In Kentucky, a land office built in 1828 included a vault room with shelving explicitly labeled for survey plats, grant records, and boundary disputes. The state's formal land survey system wouldn't be established until 1843. The room waited. The consistency of this pattern across the United States and Britain during the same narrow historical window creates a documentary puzzle. Regional planners, working independently in different political systems, with no centralized coordination, built administrative infrastructure according to templates that seemed to assume a future state apparatus that had not yet been formalized. The timing is dense. The scale is mismatched. And the coordination, if it can be called that, remains architecturally visible but institutionally unexplained. The term Tartaria originates from European cartography. For centuries, it appeared on maps as a broad geographic label referring to the vast territories of Central Asia, regions that were, to Western mapmakers, distant and incompletely understood. The name carried no implication of a unified empire or centralized civilization. It was a placeholder for areas beyond the detailed knowledge of European cartographers. By the 19th century, the term had largely disappeared from official use. But in recent years, Tartaria has been reinterpreted. Online communities and independent researchers have begun using the word not as a geographic label, but as a framework for examining architectural and infrastructural patterns that seem difficult to reconcile with conventional historical timelines. The reinterpretation is not uniform. It exists across a spectrum. At one end, Tartaria is treated as shorthand for a lost or misrepresented civilization, a global empire erased from official records. At the other end, it functions as a metaphor, a way of describing the unsettling feeling that certain historical structures, systems, and institutions appear more coordinated, more advanced, and more sudden than the timelines suggest. This documentary does not argue for either interpretation. What it does argue is that the architectural and institutional patterns observed between 1815 and 1850, particularly in the United States and Britain, create legitimate questions about the nature of bureaucratic and infrastructural expansion during that period. Three models exist for understanding these patterns. The first model is conventional. Rapid industrialization, westward expansion, and urbanization pressures drove optimistic planning. Officials anticipated growth and built accordingly. The mismatches between capacity and population reflect overestimation, not anomaly. This model accounts for isolated cases of overbuilding. It struggles to explain the consistency of the pattern across regions with vastly different economic conditions, population densities, and political structures. The second model is infrastructural inheritance. The systems, templates, and organizational frameworks embedded in these buildings were not invented during this period but inherited from earlier administrative traditions, possibly European, possibly pre-colonial, that were standardized and reproduced during the post-1815 Reconstruction wave. This model explains the architectural consistency. It raises questions about the source of those templates and why they appear so suddenly after 1816. The third model is metaphorical. Tartaria, in this reading, is not a literal empire but a conceptual stand-in for the parts of institutional history that feel discontinuous, moments when infrastructure, bureaucracy, and capacity seem to arrive fully formed rather than incrementally developed. Under this interpretation, courthouses designed for records that didn't yet exist become emblematic of a broader historical discomfort, the sense that certain systems were installed, not grown. All three interpretations have documentary merit. None can be definitively proven or dismissed using the available evidence. What remains is the evidence itself. Courthouses with vault capacity decades ahead of need. Filing systems embedded in architecture before the filing standards existed. Regional administrative buildings constructed according to templates that cross state and national boundaries with no documented coordination. These are not speculative observations. They are features of the public record. The year 1816 continues to surface as an inflection point. It was the year without a summer, a climatic anomaly caused by volcanic eruption that triggered widespread crop failure, migration, and social restructuring. In the years immediately following, infrastructure projects proliferated with unusual speed and scale. Whether this timing is coincidental or causal remains open. But the density of institutional construction during the subsequent 3 decades is difficult to ignore. Courthouses, land offices, municipal archives, transportation hubs, water systems, all built with anticipatory infrastructure, all appearing within the same compressed historical window. The term Tartaria, in its modern usage, functions as a label for this unease. It is not a conclusion. It is a placeholder, much like the original cartographic term, for something that feels unresolved. The evidence invites examination. The patterns invite interpretation. The architecture invites questions about what institutional memory looks like when it's embedded in stone, iron, and indexed shelving. In Pennsylvania, the courthouse built in 1825 still stands. Its vaults, designed for a population that wouldn't arrive for a century, were eventually filled. The records exist now. The system caught up. But the vault was there first. In Ohio, the 2-story Records Hall completed in 1830 now houses the County Historical Society. The cast-iron shelving built into the walls holds archives dating back to the building's construction. Visitors walk through rooms that waited decades to fulfill their intended purpose. The architecture was patient. In Lancashire, the town hall built in 1838 remains in use. Its basement archive chambers, with their humidity-controlled brick construction and reinforced ceilings, now preserve documents spanning nearly 2 centuries. The infrastructure that once seemed excessive now seems prescient. But prescience requires knowledge of the future. And that knowledge, documented in stone and iron across 2 continents during a 30-year period, remains one of the most architecturally visible and institutionally unexplained features of the 19th century. The courthouses waited. The records arrived. The systems formalized. The infrastructure, built decades too early, eventually found its purpose. But the question of why it was built that way, and how so many builders across so many regions calibrated their anticipation with such remarkable consistency, remains unresolved. Tartaria, as a framework, offers no answers. It offers a lens. A way of looking at infrastructure not as the product of incremental planning, but as the installation of something that arrived, in many places, already complete. The evidence is public. The archives are open. The buildings still stand. And in their vaults, Those vast, numbered, fireproof chambers built before the bureaucracies they would house had been invented. The architecture itself poses the question. What were they waiting for?